Silence suffocated the air in Courtroom 4. B. Everyone looked at Sarah, the discarded wife, the woman Richard Sterling had called hopeless and fragile in every deposition. She sat alone at the defendant's table, her hands folded calmly over a stack of bruised files. Richard, surrounded by his 3 high-priced attorneys, smirked, checking his Rolex. He thought he had already won. He thought stripping her of her credit cards and home had broken her spirit. But then the Honorable Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses, looked directly at the confident CEO, and asked one simple question that turned the entire trial and Richard's life into dust. Richard Sterling did not just file for divorce. He launched a hostile takeover of his own marriage. It happened on a Tuesday, a day usually reserved for the housekeeping staff to polish the marble floors of their sprawling estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. Sarah had been in the sunroom repotting orchids when the doorbell rang. It wasn't a guest. It was a process server followed closely by private security guards Richard had hired. "Mrs. Sterling," the guard said, his face impassive. "Mr. Sterling has requested that you vacate the premises immediately. Your access to the main house is revoked as of 9:00 a.m. Sarah froze, the ceramic pot in her hand cold against her palm. "Revoked. This is my home." "Where is Richard?" "Mr. Sterling is currently in meetings in Manhattan. He has arranged for a temporary accommodation for you at the Motel 6 off the interstate. Here are the keys." The cruelty was precise. Richard was the CEO of Sterling, and O'Connell a logistics empire worth hundreds of millions. He wore bespoke suits from Savile Row and drank scotch older than the security guard standing in the doorway. Sending his wife of 22 years to a roadside motel wasn't about money. It was about humiliation. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't throw the orchid pot. She simply wiped the dirt from her hands onto her apron and looked the guard in the eye. "I need to pack my things." "You are permitted 1 suitcase, clothing only. No jewelry, no electronics, no assets," the guard recited from a script. For 20 years, Sarah had been the silent engine behind Richard's success. When they met, he was a dispatch manager with big dreams and a mountain of debt. She was the one who worked 2 jobs to fund his first venture. She was the one who hosted the dinners that charmed investors, who remembered the birthdays of his clients' children, who smoothed over his jagged edges until he looked like a polished executive. But somewhere along the line, Richard stopped seeing a partner and started seeing an accessory that had gone out of style. He had replaced her in his mind long before he replaced her in his bed. The replacement was Lydia, a 24-year-old marketing associate with ambitious eyes and a lack of history. Lydia didn't know about Richard's gastric reflux or his fear of failure. Lydia only knew the power. Sarah packed her single suitcase. She took practical clothes, wool sweaters, sturdy trousers, and her winter coat. She left the diamond earrings he gave her for their 10th anniversary on the dresser. She left the pearls. She left the heavy gold wedding band. As she walked out of the double oak doors, the heavy click of the lock behind her sounded like a gunshot. She climbed into her 10-year-old sedan, the only car in the fleet not leased in the company name, and drove away. She didn't go to the Motel 6. She pulled into a gas station parking lot, turned off the engine, and allowed herself to cry for exactly 5 minutes. Then she dried her face. Richard thought she was weak because she was quiet. He mistook her silence for submission. It was the first of his many mistakes. 3 months later, the divorce proceedings were a spectacle of imbalance. Richard had hired aggressive legal sharks from the city, a firm known as the Butchers. They buried Sarah in paperwork. Motions to dismiss, motions to compel, emergency hearings to block her from accessing joint accounts. Sarah was living in a studio apartment above a bakery in a run-down part of town. The smell of burning yeast permeated her clothes. Richard had successfully frozen their liquid assets, claiming Sarah was mentally unstable and liable to spend recklessly a projection that would have been laughable if the judge hadn't signed the temporary order. Richard made sure the social circle knew his version of the truth. At the country club over rounds of golf, he would shake his head sadly. "She just couldn't handle the pressure of our lifestyle," he'd say to the other executives. "I tried to get her help, but she refused. It's tragic, really." Lydia was now driving Sarah's Mercedes. Sarah saw them once, stopped at a red light. Lydia was laughing, her head thrown back, wearing a scarf Sarah had bought in Paris. Richard looked smug, his hand resting possessively on the steering wheel. Sarah sat in her rusted sedan, gripping the wheel until her knuckles turned white. She wasn't angry at Lydia. Lydia was just a symptom. She was angry at herself for trusting Richard's goodness for so long. She needed a lawyer, but every high-profile attorney in the state had a conflict of interest or demanded a retainer she couldn't afford. Richard had effectively blacklisted her. "I can't help you, Mrs. Sterling," one attorney told her over the phone, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Your husband's firm represents our bank. It's a conflict." "He doesn't own the bank?" Sarah countered, her voice steady. "He might as well," the lawyer replied, and hung up. Sarah spent her nights at the local library using the free computer terminals. She wasn't looking for a job. She was looking for a weapon. She read case law. She studied forensic accounting basics. She dug through the boxes of old tax returns she had saved in a storage unit years ago, boxes Richard had forgotten about, because he thought domestic details were beneath him. She began to notice patterns, small inconsistencies in the years before the company went public. Shell companies with names that sounded like gibberish, but appeared on invoices for consulting fees. One rainy Tuesday, she found a name, Archer Consulting. It had billed Sterling and O'Connell for $500,000 in 2018 for logistical optimization. Sarah remembered 2018. That was the year Richard had fired half the warehouse staff to save money. He hadn't spent $500,000 on consulting. She needed someone who wasn't afraid of Richard. She didn't need a shark. She needed a wolf, someone hungry, scrappy, and slightly outside the system. She found Ben Miller. Ben Miller's office was located in a strip mall between a vape shop and a dry cleaner. The sign above the door was missing the E in Miller. When Sarah walked in, Ben was eating a tuna sandwich with one hand and typing furiously with the other. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He was young, perhaps early 30s, with messy hair and a tie that was slightly askew. He looked up surprised to see a woman with Sarah's posture in his waiting room. "Delivery?" he asked. "No," Sarah said, placing her single, heavy binder on his desk. "I need representation." Ben wiped crumbs from his mouth. "I do DU-is and slip and falls, lady. You look like you need estate planning." "I need a divorce attorney." Ben laughed. "If you have money for a suit like that." He pointed to her worn but high-quality blazer. "You can afford better than me." "My husband is Richard Sterling." The room went quiet. Ben stopped chewing. "The logistics guy, the one who's all over the business use?" "Yes. And you want me to go up against his team? Lady, they'll eat me for breakfast and use my tie as a napkin. I can't take that case." "They won't see you coming," Sarah said. "That's the point. Richard is arrogant. He looks at people like you and sees nothing, just like he looks at me." She opened the binder. It wasn't full of sob stories. It was full of spreadsheets. Sarah had spent 20 years balancing the household budget, but before she was a wife, she had been a bookkeeper. She pointed to the entry for Archer Consulting. "Richard thinks he's hidden his assets." Sarah explained, her voice low and precise. "He's moved money into offshore accounts disguised as vendor payments. He claims the business is barely profitable this quarter to lower the alimony settlement. But look at the dates." Ben leaned in his eyes, scanning the numbers. His demeanor changed. The messy, tired lawyer vanished, replaced by a sharp, calculating mind. He traced a line on the paper. "He's cycling the cash," Ben muttered, "paying his own shell companies, claiming it as an expense to lower taxable income, then parking the cash. That's what we need to find out in court," Sarah said. "I don't have money for a retainer, Ben, but if we win, you get 20% of the settlement." Ben looked at her. He saw the tired lines around her eyes, but he also saw the steel in her spine. He realized that Richard Sterling had made a grave error in judgment regarding his wife's capabilities. 30%, Ben said. 25, Sarah countered instantly. Ben grinned, extending a hand. "Deal. Let's go take down a giant." The day of the trial arrived with the heaviness of a summer storm. The courtroom was packed. Richard had ensured the press was there, though he pretended to ignore them. He wanted the world to see him magnanimously divorcing his troubled wife. Richard sat with his team, 3 men in grey suits, who whispered constantly. When Sarah entered with Ben, a ripple of amusement went through the opposing bench. Ben's suit was ill-fitting, and he carried a battered leather briefcase. Richard caught Sarah's eye and gave her a pitying smile, mouthing the word, "Really?" Sarah sat down, staring straight ahead. Judge Harrison, a stern man with a reputation for zero tolerance for theatrics, called the court to order. Richard's lead attorney, a man named Mr. Calloway, stood up. He had a voice like oiled velvet. "Your Honor, this is a simple case. Mr. Sterling has been the sole provider for the family for 2 decades. He has built an empire through his own sweat and blood. Mrs. Sterling, unfortunately, has contributed little beyond domestic duties, which she abandoned months ago. We are offering a generous settlement of monthly alimony for 3 years, conditioned on Mrs. Sterling seeking psychiatric evaluation." It was a narrative designed to destroy her credibility. Psychiatric evaluation. They were playing the crazy ex-wife card. Ben stood up. He looked nervous. He shuffled his papers. Your Honor, we contest the characterization of the assets." Richard chuckled audibly. Mr. Calloway rolled his eyes. "Proceed," Judge Harrison said, looking bored. The first 2 days were brutal. Richard's team paraded witnesses, friends of Richard employees, who were paid to be loyal, who testified to Sarah's erratic behavior. They claimed she was forgetful, emotional, perhaps drinking too much. Sarah sat stoically. Every lie was a lash, but she didn't flinch. She knew the strategy. They were trying to provoke an outburst. If she screamed, if she cried, she proved them right. Then it was Richard's turn to take the stand. He walked to the witness box with the confidence of a man addressing a shareholders' meeting. He swore to tell the truth, a hand casually in his pocket. Calloway led him through the softballs. "Mr. Sterling, tell us about the financial state of your company." "It's been a hard year," Richard lied smoothly. "The market is down. Margins are thin. Honestly, the alimony she's asking for would bankrupt the company. I have a responsibility to my employees. And these allegations of hidden assets." Richard laughed, a warm, charming sound. "Fabrications. Fantasies. My wife, Sarah, has always had a vivid imagination. I think she reads too many mystery novels." The courtroom tittered. Sarah remained stone-faced. Then it was Ben's turn to cross-examine. Ben walked up to the podium. He looked disorganized. He dropped a pen, picked it up, and apologized. Richard smirked. "Mr. Sterling," Ben began. "You stated that Sterling and O'Connell is struggling. That is correct. And you have disclosed all financial accounts to this court, every single penny." "Absolutely," Richard said, looking at the judge. "I have nothing to hide." "Okay," Ben said, scratching his head. "I'm just a little confused about some of the vendors. Can we talk about Archer Consulting?" Richard's face didn't change, but his hand tightened slightly on the railing of the witness box. A micro-reaction. Sarah saw it. "A standard vendor," Richard said dismissively. "Supply chain optimization." Right, Ben said. "And Blue Horizon Logistics, another vendor." "Yes, shipping partners." "And Vanguard Holdings." "Property management for our warehouses," Richard snapped, getting irritated. "Is there a point to this list?" "Just checking," Ben said innocently. "Because, Mr. Sterling, we found it interesting that all three of these companies have registered addresses in the same building in the Cayman Islands. A building that, according to Google Earth, is a post office box." "I don't micromanage where my vendors rent office space," Richard retorted. "Of course not," Ben said. "No further questions for now." Richard stepped down, looking victorious. He thought he had dodged the bullet. He didn't realize Ben hadn't fired the bullet yet. He was just loading the gun. The real drama was scheduled for the next day. Sarah had one ace left to play, and it wasn't a document. It was a person. The courtroom doors opened, and a hush fell over the gallery. Ben Miller, looking more disheveled than usual, but with a glint in his eye that terrified Richard's legal team, called his next witness. "The defense calls Lydia Banks to the stand." Richard froze. He whispered furiously to Mr. Calloway. "You said she wouldn't be involved. You said we were keeping her out of this." "We didn't subpoena her," Calloway hissed back, his face pale. "They did." Lydia walked down the aisle. She looked like a runway model who had taken a wrong turn into a government building. She wore a cream-colored suit that cost more than Ben's car, and she avoided looking at Sarah. She took the stand, flipping her hair over her shoulder, radiating a confidence that was entirely unearned. Ben approached the stand. He didn't hold a notepad. He held a single, thin document. "Ms. Banks," Ben started, his voice deceptively polite. "You are currently employed as the Vice President of Marketing at Sterling and O'Connell, is that correct?" "Yes," Lydia said, her voice crisp. "And your salary was tripled 3 weeks before Mr. Sterling filed for divorce." "I received a promotion based on merit," Lydia snapped, glancing at Richard for support. Richard gave her a tight, encouraging nod. "Of course," Ben said. "Merit." "Now, Ms. Banks, are you familiar with a company called Apex Holdings?" Lydia hesitated. I've heard the name. I believe they handle our overseas shipping containers." "You believe?" Ben walked closer. "That's strange, because according to this incorporation document from the British Virgin Islands, you are the sole director and CEO of Apex Holdings." The courtroom gasped. Sarah watched Richard. He wasn't looking at Lydia anymore. He was looking at the exit sign. I sign a lot of paperwork for Richard." "For Mr. Sterling," Lydia stammered. "He tells me it's for tax efficiency." "Tax efficiency," Ben repeated, tasting the words. "So when you signed the documents opening a bank account in Zurich under the name Apex Holdings, you were just doing what you were told." "I didn't open a bank account." Lydia's voice rose an octave. "I just signed some forms Richard gave me over dinner." Ben turned to the jury, then back to Lydia. Ms. Banks, are you aware that Apex Holdings has received $12 million in consulting fees from Sterling and O'Connell over the last 2 years, and that those funds were then used to purchase a penthouse in Manhattan, the very penthouse you are currently living in? Lydia went pale. She looked at Richard. Richard, you said the company paid for the apartment. Richard stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tight. He refused to meet her eyes. Richard told me it was a corporate perk, Lydia cried out, turning to the judge. I didn't steal anything. I believe you, Ben said softly. But here is the problem, Ms. Banks. Since you are the sole director of Apex Holdings, and since Apex Holdings has paid 0 taxes on that $12 million income, you are personally liable for tax evasion. Unless... Ben let the word hang in the air. Unless what? Lydia whispered. She was trembling now. The arrogance was gone. She was just a 24-year-old girl who realized she had been handed a loaded grenade. Unless you can prove that you were acting under the direct instructions of the true beneficiary. Unless you can tell us who actually controls the money. Lydia looked at Richard. She saw the man she thought loved her. She saw him sitting there, letting her dangle in the wind, letting her take the fall for a felony to protect his own skin. In that moment, the illusion of power and romance disintegrated. She realized she wasn't the new queen. She was just the new scapegoat. It was him, Lydia screamed, pointing a manicured finger at Richard. He made me sign them. He has the passwords. He has the tokens. He told me if I put it in my name, his wife wouldn't be able to touch it in the divorce. He said Sarah was too stupid to find it. Pandemonium erupted in the courtroom. Judge Harrison banged his gavel, the sound cracking like a whip through the noise. Order, order in this court. Sarah sat perfectly still. She didn't smile. She just watched Richard's face turn a shade of grey that matched his suit. He had underestimated everyone. He thought his wife was weak. He thought his mistress was loyal. He was wrong on both counts. But the war wasn't over. Richard Sterling was a cornered animal, and cornered animals bite. The air in Courtroom 4B had turned stagnant heavy with the scent of floor wax and nervous perspiration. The gallery, packed to capacity with press, legal clerks, and curious onlookers, buzzed with a low-frequency energy. They had just watched Lydia Banks, the confident mistress, crumble into tears and accuse Richard of tax fraud. It should have been the end. Any rational man would have instructed his attorneys to settle immediately to stop the bleeding before a federal artery was severed. But Richard Sterling was not a rational man. He was a narcissist who had spent 20 years believing his own press releases. At the defense table, his lead attorney, Mr. Calloway, was gripping Richard's forearm so hard his knuckles were white. "Do not do this," Calloway hissed, his voice a frantic whisper. "We can request a recess. We can spin this. But if you take the stand now, after what she just said, you are walking into a firing line." Richard shook him off with a sneer of disgust. He adjusted his silk tie, checking his reflection in the darkened screen of his phone. "You're fired, Calloway. You couldn't control a hysterical girl. I'll handle this myself. I've handled hostile boardrooms, union strikes, and federal audits. I can handle a small-town judge and a wife who buys her clothes at Target." Richard stood up. The movement was sudden, commanding attention. "Your Honor," he announced, his voice booming with that practiced baritone that had charmed investors for decades. "I wish to take the stand to clear up these unfortunate misunderstandings." Judge Harrison peered over the rim of his spectacles. He was a man of few words, known for a temperament that moved as slowly and destructively as a glacier. He studied Richard for a long, uncomfortable moment. "Mister," Sterling against the advice of your counsel. The truth needs no counsel, Your Honor, Richard said smoothly. Sarah, sitting beside Ben Miller, felt a cold knot in her stomach. Richard looked so confident. For a second, the old fear returned. What if he talks his way out of it? He always had before. He could sell ice to a polar bear. Surely he could sell a lie to a judge. Ben leaned over, scribbling on a yellow legal pad. "Let him talk," Ben wrote, digging his own grave. Richard walked to the witness box. He didn't look like a defendant. He looked like he was about to give a keynote speech. He sat down, crossed his legs, and smiled benevolently at the jury. The direct examination conducted by his clearly terrified junior associate went exactly as Richard planned. He painted a masterpiece of victimhood. "Lydia is a troubled young woman," Richard explained, his tone laced with sad regret. "I tried to mentor her. I saw potential. When she asked for help setting up her own business structure, I offered advice. I had no idea she was using my name to move funds. I am shocked, truly shocked, and frankly hurt that my generosity has been twisted into this conspiracy." He turned his eyes to Sarah. "And my wife, my ex-wife, she knows I have always been transparent. This hunt for hidden assets is just a way to punish me for falling out of love. It's vindictive." The jury looked at him. A few nodded. He was good. He was terrifyingly good. He made the millions of dollars in the Cayman Islands sound like a clerical error made by a rogue intern. Then it was time for cross-examination. Ben Miller stood up. He buttoned his jacket, which was missing a button, and approached the stand. He looked like a man who had lost his keys, not a legal shark. "Mr. Sterling," Ben began, scratching his head. "So just to be clear, the $12 million in Apex Holdings, not yours?" "Absolutely not," Richard said. "And the $8 million in Archer Consulting, the company that billed your firm for clouds." "Cloud computing," Richard corrected condescendingly. "And no, that is an external vendor." Right, external." Ben shuffled his papers, dropping one on the floor. He bent to pick it up, looking flustered. Richard smirked at the jury, inviting them to share in his amusement at this incompetent lawyer. "And the safety deposit box in Zurich, the one Lydia mentioned, I have never been to that bank." Richard lied. He didn't blink. He didn't fidget. He looked the jury in the eye. "I am a man of integrity. I have built Sterling and O'Connell with hard work. I don't need to hide money." Ben sighed. He looked defeated. "No further questions." Richard began to rise, a triumphant smile plastered on his face. He had done it. He had weathered the storm. Mr. Sterling remained seated. The voice didn't come from the lawyers. It came from the bench. Judge Harrison had not moved for the last hour. He had sat like a statue, watching Richard, with eyes that were unreadable. Now he leaned forward, clasping his hands together on the dark mahogany wood. "I have a few questions," the judge said. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Of course, Your Honor," Richard said, though his smile faltered slightly. "I am happy to clarify." "You have been very clear," Judge Harrison said. His voice was soft conversational, which made it all the more terrifying. "You have stated under oath multiple times that the assets in Apex Holdings, Archer Consulting, and the various offshore accounts identified by Mr. Miller do not belong to you." "That is correct." "You have stated that you have no control over them, no beneficiary interest in them, and no ability to access them." "I do not," Richard affirmed. "They belong to third-party vendors. I am being framed, and therefore The judge continued, slowly removing his glasses and placing them on the desk. If this court were to take action regarding those specific funds, it would not impact you personally, since, as you say, it is not your money. Richard paused. He sensed a trap, but he couldn't see the teeth yet. I suppose not, though I would worry about my vendors being treated unfairly. We aren't talking about the vendors right now. We are talking about you, the judge said. He picked up a document, a court order that had been drafted during the lunch recess. Mr. Sterling, the court finds itself in a unique position. We have $25 million sitting in accounts that Ms. Banks claims are yours and you claim are not yours. They appear to be orphaned. The judge picked up a pen. So here is what I am going to do. Since you have sworn this money is not yours, I am going to issue an immediate judicial order to seize these assets. I will instruct the banks to liquidate all $25 million by the close of business today. Richard's face went pale. Liquidate, yes, the judge said pleasantly. And since there is no clear owner, I will order the entire sum to be donated to the State Victims' Compensation Fund and several local charities for the homeless. It seems like a wonderful way to turn this confusion into a public good. And since it isn't your money, you surely have no objection to charity, do you, Mr. Sterling? The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum that sucked the oxygen out of the room. Richard stared at the judge. His brain was misfiring. He was doing the math. If he said yes, if he agreed to the donation, he maintained his innocence. He would avoid the perjury charge. He would avoid the tax fraud implication. But he would lose $25 million. The money he had skimmed for years, the retirement fund, the golden parachute. It would be gone instantly, given to people he considered beneath him. If he said no. Well, Mr. Sterling. The judge's pen hovered over the signature line. I'm about to sign. Do you consent to the donation of these external funds? Richard's chest heaved. Sweat beaded on his upper lip. He looked at the paper. He could see the numbers in his head, the zeros, all that power, all that freedom. He had sacrificed his marriage for that money. He had sacrificed his relationship with his children. He had broken laws. He couldn't let it go. Greed was not just a habit for Richard. It was his DNA. No! Richard shouted. The word ripped out of his throat, raw and ugly. He stood up, slamming his hands on the witness box railing. You can't do that. You can't just give it away. Judge Harrison didn't blink. He simply raised an eyebrow. And why not Mr. Sterling? I thought it wasn't yours. Because it's mine! Richard roared, his face turning a violent shade of crimson. The mask of the polished CEO shattered completely, revealing the desperate, grasping man beneath. I earned it. I moved it. It's my money. You can't give my money to a bunch of homeless bums I built that fortune. The confession hung in the air, echoing off the high ceilings. The court stenographer stopped typing, her mouth slightly open. The jury looked at one another, eyes wide. Even Ben Miller looked surprised by the sheer volume of the outburst. Richard stood there, panting, his chest heaving. Slowly, the red haze of rage cleared from his vision, and he saw where he was. He saw the judge staring at him with cold satisfaction. He saw the court reporter waiting. He saw the jury. He looked at his lawyers. Mr. Calloway had his face buried in his hands. Richard slowly sank back into the chair. He looked small. The bespoke suit suddenly seemed too big for him. Thank you, Mr. Sterling, Judge Harrison said, his voice dropping to a final heavy gavel strike of a tone. The record will reflect that the defendant has admitted under oath to ownership and control of the undisclosed offshore assets. The record will further reflect that these assets were hidden to defraud this court and the defendant's spouse. The judge turned to the bailiff. Please take Mr. Sterling's passport into custody immediately. I am referring the transcript of this confession to the district attorney's office regarding the admitted tax evasion and perjury. Richard slumped. He didn't look at the gallery. He didn't look at the press. He couldn't bring himself to look at anyone, except Sarah. As the chaos of the courtroom erupted around them, reporters shouting questions, lawyers scrambling, Richard turned his head. He looked at the woman he had discarded. He looked for the fear he was used to seeing. He looked for the hesitation. Sarah was standing. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't gloating. She was simply watching him with a profound, terrifying clarity. She looked like a stranger to him. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, bringing the room back to order. Mrs. Sterling, he addressed her. In light of this confession, the division of assets will be significantly adjusted. But before I issue the final decree, is there anything you wish to say to the court or to your husband? The room went quiet again. Everyone looked at Sarah. The weak wife, the woman who had been kicked out of her home with one suitcase. Sarah walked around the table. She stood in the center of the aisle, facing the man who had vowed to love and cherish her, the man who had tried to leave her with nothing but crumbs. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried to the back of the room without a tremor. 22 years ago, Richard told me that he was the visionary, and I was just the support staff. He told me that without him, I was invisible. She took a step closer to the witness box. Richard flinched. When he evicted me, Sarah continued, her eyes locking onto Richard's. He asked me a question. He laughed and asked, "What are you going to do without me, Sarah?" He thought I would crumble. He thought I would beg. Sarah paused. She took a breath, inhaling the air of the courtroom, which suddenly felt lighter, cleaner. I'd like to answer him now, she said. I'm going to survive Richard. I'm going to breathe. And most importantly, I'm going to take half. She turned back to the judge and sat down, smoothing her skirt. She didn't look at Richard again. He was no longer her husband. He was no longer her problem. He was just a line item on a spreadsheet that she had finally permanently balanced. The silence that followed Sarah's declaration was absolute. I'm going to take half. It wasn't a request. It was a notification. Richard slumped in his chair, the fight draining out of him like water from a cracked vessel. He looked at his legal team, the expensive butchers from the city, and found no sympathy. Mr. Calloway was already packing his briefcase, distancing himself from the client, who had just committed perjury and confessed to tax evasion on public record. Judge Harrison cleared his throat. The sound was dry and final, like the closing of a heavy book. The court thanks Mrs. Sterling for her statement, the judge said, his eyes shifting back to Richard. Mr. Sterling, you have played a very dangerous game in my courtroom. You attempted to use the legal system as a weapon against your spouse, all while hiding a fortune behind a veil of corporate shell games. Today that veil has been torn down. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked at the papers before him. Regarding the division of assets, Judge Harrison announced, his voice ringing with authority. In light of the defendant's proven financial misconduct, I am invoking the dissipation of assets statute. The standard equitable distribution does not apply here. Richard's head snapped up. What does that mean? He rasped. It means, the judge said coldly, that I am awarding Mrs. Sterling the marital home in Greenwich fully paid off, I am awarding her 100% of the legitimate domestic retirement accounts. I am also awarding her a lump sum of $15 million from the liquid assets to be paid immediately." $15 million, Richard choked out. That's all the operating cash the company has. Then I suggest you liquidate some of your personal toys, Mr. Sterling. Furthermore, the judge continued, pointing a finger at the transcript, regarding the $25 million in offshore accounts you just claimed as yours. Since those funds were obtained through what appears to be tax fraud, I am placing an immediate freezing order on them. They will be held in escrow pending the inevitable federal investigation. You won't be able to touch a dime of that money to pay your legal fees, your alimony, or your country club dues. The gavel raised. Divorce granted. Restraining order granted. Court is adjourned. Bang! The sound was explosive. The courtroom erupted. Reporters pushed forward, shouting questions. Richard sat frozen, a man who had walked in as a king and was walking out as a pauper with an indictment hanging over his head. Sarah didn't look at him. She turned to Ben Miller. The young lawyer was grinning, a look of sheer exhausted exhaustion on his face. "We did it," Ben whispered, as if he couldn't quite believe it himself. "No," Sarah corrected him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did it. I just survived it." The weeks following the trial were a slow-motion car crash for Richard Sterling. It started with the board meeting. 3 days after the verdict, the board of directors of Sterling and O'Connell convened. They didn't even let Richard into the building. Security met him in the lobby, the same lobby where his portrait hung on the wall, and handed him a box of his personal effects. "The board has voted to remove you as CEO, effective immediately," the head of human resources said, refusing to make eye contact. "Your access pass has been deactivated." Richard stood on the sidewalk, holding a box containing a stapler, a photo of himself with a senator, and a stress ball. It was raining. He waited for his driver, then remembered the company car had been repossessed that morning. He had to hail a cab. Then came the federal agents. They arrived at his luxury condo, the one Lydia had been living in, at 6 a.m. They seized computers, files, and phones. Lydia was nowhere to be found. She had cut a deal. In exchange for her testimony and handing over the encryption keys to the offshore accounts, she had been granted immunity and had moved back to Ohio to live with her parents. She hadn't even left Richard a note. Richard found himself living in a short-term rental apartment near the airport. The friends he had bragged to at the golf course stopped returning his calls. The politicians he had donated to suddenly didn't know his name. He was toxic. He spent his days drinking cheap scotch and watching the news, seeing his name in headlines. Sterling scandal, CEO, admits fraud in divorce. Shocker. He blamed everyone but himself. He blamed the judge. He blamed Ben Miller. He blamed Lydia. But mostly he blamed Sra. In his twisted narrative, she was the villain. She was the one who had ruined his life by not simply fading away when he told her to. While Richard's world was contracting, Sra's was expanding. The first month was strange. She woke up in the massive Greenwich house, the silence ringing in her ears. For 20 years, her schedule had been dictated by Richard's needs, his dinner parties, his travel schedule, his moods. Now the time was hers. She didn't rush to fill it. She spent mornings drinking coffee on the terrace, watching the sun come up over the garden. She hired a crew to finally fix the greenhouse. She planted hydrangeas, not because they were impressive to guests, but because she liked the color blue. But she knew she couldn't stay there. The house was a monument to a dead marriage. Every room held a memory of a slighter criticism or a lonely night waiting for a husband who wasn't coming home. She put the estate on the market. It sold in 3 days to a tech billionaire from California. With the proceeds plus the settlement money, Sarah was wealthier than she had ever imagined. But the money didn't thrill her. The freedom did. One afternoon, she walked into Ben Miller's office. The sign above the door still had the missing E, but the waiting room was full. Since the trial, Ben had become a local legend. He was the giant slayer. Ben saw her and waved her into his office, ignoring the stack of files on his desk. "Sarah, to what do I owe the pleasure? Please tell me Richard isn't trying to sue you for emotional distress." "He can try." Sarah laughed. She sat down, pulling a checkbook out of her purse. "I'm here for business, Ben. I told you the bill is settled. You paid me my percentage. This isn't for you. It's for the others." Sarah placed a check on his desk. The amount made Ben's eyes widen. "I want to start a legal defense fund for women like me. Women who are told they are weak, who are starved of resources, who are bullied into bad settlements because they can't afford a fighter like you." Ben looked at the check, then up at Sarah. His eyes were misty. "The Sarah Sterling Foundation." "No," Sarah said firmly. "My maiden name, the Sarah Connors Foundation. Sterling is a brand I don't wear anymore." 6 months after the gavel fell, Sarah returned to the Greenwich estate one last time. It was closing day. The movers had cleared out the last of the furniture. The house was an empty shell of marble and mahogany. Sarah walked through the rooms, her heels clicking on the hardwood. She felt light. There was no sadness, only the quiet satisfaction of a job finished. She checked the sunroom. The dead orchids were gone, replaced by fresh, thriving ferns she was leaving for the new owners. She walked out the front door, locking it behind her. She dropped the keys into an envelope for the realtor. As she turned toward her car, a sensible but luxurious SUV she had bought for herself, she saw a taxi idling at the bottom of the long driveway. The passenger door opened, and a man stepped out. It took Sarah a moment to recognize him. Richard had lost weight. His suit was baggy, the shoulders slumped. His hair, usually dyed a rich chestnut, was showing grey at the roots. He looked like a photocopy of Richard Sterling, faded blurry and low on toner. He walked up the driveway, stopping 10 feet away from her. He looked at the house, then at Sarah. "You sold it," he said. His voice was raspy. "I did," Sarah replied comfortably. She didn't cross her arms. She didn't retreat. She stood her ground. "It was my dream house, Sarah. I designed that library. I imported that stone. It was a house, Richard, not a home. There's a difference." Richard looked at her, and for a second, a flash of his old anger sparked in his eyes. "You think you won, don't you? You took my company. You took my reputation. You took my house." "I didn't take anything," Sarah said calmly. "I simply collected what was owed. And you lost those things all on your own. You lost the company when you defrauded it. You lost your reputation when you lied under oath. And you lost the house when you kicked me out of it." Richard let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his messy hair. "I'm facing 5 years, Sarah. Federal prison. The lawyers say if I plead out, I might get 3. 3 years in a cell." He looked at her, his expression shifting from anger to a pathetic sort of pleading. He took a step forward. "I have no one," he whispered. "The kids, they won't talk to me. Jason hung up on me yesterday. Emily returned my letters unopened. They are adults, Richard. They saw what you did. You can't control them with credit cards anymore, so you have to build a relationship. That takes time." "I don't have time," Richard snapped. "I have nothing. I'm living in a studio apartment. I'm eating takeout." He looked at her, his eyes searching for the woman who used to fix everything. "Sarah, I know I made mistakes. I know I was difficult. But we were partners for 20 years. Doesn't that mean anything? Can't you? Isn't there anything you can do? A character reference, alone, just until I get back on my feet. There it was, the core of him. Even now, standing in the wreckage of his own making, he saw her as a resource. He didn't want forgiveness. He wanted utility. He wanted the wife who smoothed things over. Sarah looked at him with a pity that cut deeper than hate. I wrote a character reference for the judge, actually, Sarah said. Richard's face lit up with hope. You did? Yes, I told him the truth. I told him that you are a man of immense talent and drive, and I told him that you are a man who believes the rules apply to everyone but himself. Richard's face fell. As for alone, Sarah continued, her voice hardening just enough to show the steel beneath. You have $25 million sitting in an escrow account, Richard. Why don't you ask the feds for it? You're cruel, he spat. I thought you were kind. I thought you were the nice one. I am kind, Sarah said. She opened her car door. I'm kind to myself now. That means not letting toxic people back into my life. What are you going to do? Richard demanded, desperation rising in his voice as he realized she was leaving. He looked panic-stricken. You've never been alone. You don't know how to function without me directing the ship. Sarah paused with her hand on the doorframe. She looked at the blue sky, then back at the small, angry man in the driveway. You asked me that before, she said. You asked what I would do without you. She smiled. It wasn't a vengeful smile. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated peace. I'm going to live, Richard. I'm going to run my foundation. I'm going to travel to places you never wanted to go. I'm going to eat dinner at 5 p.m. if I want to, or 9 p.m. I'm going to be happy. You'll fail, he shouted, his voice cracking. You're nothing without the sterling name. Watch me, Sarah said. She got into the car, started the engine, and put it in drive. As she rolled down the driveway, she glanced in the rearview mirror. Richard was still standing there, a tiny figure against the backdrop of the massive, empty mansion. He looked like a ghost, haunting a graveyard he had dug for himself. Sarah turned onto the main road and accelerated. The wind rushed through the open window, smelling of pine and impending rain. She didn't turn the radio on. She didn't need distraction. She just wanted to listen to the sound of her own life beginning. She drove past the turnoff for the motel where he had tried to send her. She drove past the courthouse. She drove toward the highway, toward the city, toward Ben's office, toward the future. The rear-view mirror was empty now. The past was gone. And for the first time in 22 years, Sarah Connors didn't look back. They say the wheels of justice grind slowly, but in the case of Richard Sterling, they ground exceedingly fine. He thought his wife was a fixture, a piece of furniture that would stay where he put it. He mistook her silence for weakness and her patience for stupidity. It was a miscalculation that cost him his fortune, his freedom, and his family. Sarah's journey proves that the greatest revenge isn't screaming or fighting dirty. The greatest revenge is simply taking your power back, standing in your truth, and living a life so full and vibrant that the people who tried to bury you become nothing more than a footnote in your biography. Richard built an empire on lies, but Sarah built a future on the truth. And in the end, the judge's one simple question didn't just expose a bank account. It exposed the soul of a man who had none. If this story of ultimate vindication gave you chills, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story about justice served cold. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Sarah's shoes? Would you have helped Richard in the end? Or did he get exactly what he deserved? Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.